Let's start this now. First question to John Shipton. Firstly and most importantly, John, we're hearing disturbing reports about Julian's physical and mental state. Can you tell us how he is?
Thank you everybody for coming. Julian is in a dire circumstance. He's lost 15 kilos of weight, very skinny now. He's in solitary confinement sort of for 22 hours a day. Whenever I go to visit or anybody goes to visit, the hallways are cleared and Julian's brought down through long empty hallways into the meeting room. There's usually about 100 other prisoners and their visitors in the meeting room. There's cameras everywhere in the ceiling, and each prisoner wears a band. You have to speak like this, so that you can't be lip-read if you want to exchange private information. You know, if I ask Julian, how are you? Or any other personal information, you know, his children or so on. So after nearly 10 years of ceaseless psychological pressure in an increasing intensity and trajectory, in the last 2 years, where every single move and voice and action he made in the embassy, every single one, nothing. So the toilets, everything, the ladies' toilet had microphones in it because the lawyers and Julian would occasionally have their conferences there so that they wouldn't be overheard. But they installed a microphone behind the paper towels. So you can imagine the effect of that year after year. And towards the very end, rude and aggressive security men, lawyers given permission to visit and sent away, food forgotten to be delivered because it's their responsibility to feed him, he can't go out. He had an abscess on his tooth, and his lawyers wrote to the UK government that could he cross their land to go to the dentist. They said, you come outside, you'll be arrested. So you can just get, you know, a picture of the ceaseless persecution, in particular delicate ways that Julian underwent, detailed ways. After 5 years, the room he was in, he knew every crack, every thread falling off the curtains, every piece of paint peeling off, a bird landing on the window as a friend, you know. So, not good circumstance.
So, you've told us a little bit about his conditions, John, in Belmarsh prison. Would you say that it basically amounts to torture?
Yes, Nils Melzer, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture and Degrading Treatment, released a report wherein he described that Julian suffered smearing, mobbing and ceaseless persecution by the United Kingdom's prosecutorial office and the Swedish prosecutorial office. The allegations are fake. Just briefly, there were 4 prosecutors, can you believe? The allegations were dismissed 3 times. There were 2 interviews, and it took 9 years. It only took 8 years to put a man on the moon. So you can see, in my view, the Swedish prosecutor ought to be arraigned for miscarriage of justice. And now Sweden is seen as a place, there's a ruined reputation for justice and selling junk furniture. That's what they've done. to Sweden's reputation.
Thanks, John. Just a quick follow-up. Julian breached his bail conditions and sought refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy. Now that, with the change of government there, he was handed over to the British authorities. Does Julian feel it was worth it, staying in the Ecuadorian embassy all that time? Because it was fairly poor conditions there, as I understand it.
I have some other children. One of them's here. There's that little girl in the front there. That's Julian's young sister. She's shy now. My children have never complained to me about anything. Not a word. In the 10 years, Julian never complained once. I went there every Christmas for 2 weeks, and of course quite a lot lately. Not once did he complain or moan about his situation or how heavy the burden was. So I don't know whether he thinks it's worth it. As far as I can see from the outside, his resolve is undiminished.
Julian faces extradition to the US and 175 years in prison, as I understand it, if found guilty of all charges. What is his greatest fear?
Well, naturally, he's horrified of going to jail in the United States. It'll be in Virginia. Specialist expert reports that the lawyers have commissioned describe jail situations and the powers of the jailers excuse me. Adele, is she all right? Yes. Thank you. Thank you. The powers of the prison governors and the powers of the prosecutors to place him wherever they see fit, wherever they want. So he is horrified of that circumstance, as I am, and I would be if I were in. But I don't consider that myself. I just fight on. I don't count the cost. Just we're here with you, and us together hold Julian up, not the politicians and the big wigs. It's us. We hold him up. Let me just describe briefly. There's a person here who'll speak in a minute. His name's Philip Adams. You may have heard of him. He's done a tremendous petition. Now, Philip works with Matthew, who runs our website. Matthew has designed an app, 3-step app that allows you to send an email to your Member of Parliament. We, that's us, have sent Members of Parliament over the last 40 hours 14,000 emails. So you can see that's us, and we carry the injustice, we carry Julian. It's a noble task we've taken upon ourselves. There's no task greater at the moment. It's of course to lead along with environmental degradation, and we carry the task, this noble task, with all conviction, and I thank you.
Just a question for Ciaron O'Reilly, who's been sitting patiently. Ciaron, you've become famous for, among other things, your non-violent anti-war protests, for which, for defacing and disabling war aircraft, American war aircraft, you, like Julian, served some time in prison. I think 12 months in prison in the US, is that right? 13? Yeah. Just wondering whether you could explain what the conditions were like for you and what it was like.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country and also acknowledge the war of genocide against them and a war that continues, which is an only explanation for 30% of the prison population of this country being Indigenous. And also acknowledge the war against the people of Iraq. And that's the context in which Chelsea Manning finds herself back in prison and Julian in a British prison. And I actually coincidentally happened to be there the first day of that war. We were at the Pentagon on Hiroshima Day, and Margaret Thatcher and George Bush Sr. turned up and announced the sanctions on Iraq. And then we had the drive-by Gulf War I where they dropped 8 Hiroshimas on Iraq, and then we had the collapse of the anti-war movement, and then we had 10 years of sanctions where 1 million children were killed, and then we have the invasion, and then we have the occupation, and now there are thousands of US troops being sent back there as we speak. Prison's designed for every prisoner to demoralise and defeat you, and especially for political prisoners to get you to recant. And in my situation, I was sentenced in New York and put on Con Air and flown across the country through Oklahoma to El Paso, Texas, and then shipped out into the outback and put in a very overcrowded jail. I was the only gringo in the jail, only representative of the master race, and only white boy, and that's a joke. And so there were 24 of us in a cage. The cage was about this wide, and then 6 cages welded together in one room. There were 3 prison officers who would disappear at the first sign of trouble, and it would take about 40 minutes for the riot squad to come back in. So it was a very violent and boring place. And the only thing, the first month they had a lot of harassment, low-level assault, harassment by the prison officers and other young gang members, and that disappeared once they started getting correspondence in. And the staff backed off immediately, not feeling I had reach on the outside, and I got popular with Mexican stamp collectors and kind of built my popular base from there. So I really encourage you to write to Julian. It sends a message to the staff that he isn't forgotten, and it also, I've been with Julian in the embassy when he opens letters, and I mean, the biggest thing for a prisoner is knowing your out date, and Julian for 9 years, it was 9 years on the 7th of December that he's first taken to Wandsworth prison, has never had an out date. And I lived outside the embassy on the street. I was outside for a year, but 5 months, 24/7. And to watch the British police, the special branch openly parked there, they had an apartment directly opposite the embassy, to watch the armed police screech to a halt in front of the embassy, just attacking methodically his mental health and trying to stress him out, was a sight to behold, really.
A question for you again, John. How does Julian reconcile the fact that publications such as The Guardian, The Washington Post, New York Times, Sydney Morning Herald and others have all published his material and actually profited from it, but have not faced any legal repercussions, whereas Julian is in jail?
Thank you. That's a very good question with no answer. The first people to publish were actually, the story is this, that the New York Times, Der Spiegel and Guardian sought to deceive Julian and to get WikiLeaks and Julian to publish first. That means that they would never be blamed because they were just publishing something that was already out there. So their scheme went. But on Friday, Julian spent all Friday night, about 24 hours continuous work, redacting 10,000 names from the publications, 10,000 names. Now, WikiLeaks was due to go out on the Monday morning. As the presses roll, their hard copies, they can't stop. But WikiLeaks had a bug, a flaw, and they couldn't publish until Tuesday. So the first people to publish were those that schemed to get Julian to be the first people to publish through an accident that WikiLeaks' website wasn't quite ready. Now, that's the circumstance. This is a deliberate persecution of an Australian citizen who published things in Europe, not in the United States. So there was Der Spiegel, it's German. There's El Pais, it's Spanish. There's Le Monde, it's French. There's The Guardian, it's UK. There's the Sydney Morning Herald. There's The Age, the Courier Mail. These publications are international, but principally European. Extraterritorial judicial reach of the United States, I call it judicial kidnapping, really. It's not only Julian, it'll be anybody who publishes, any journalist who writes, any publication who prints or puts online. Well, I think they're already intimidated. They're already intimidated. You know, it would cost, there's probably 100 lawyers working on Julian's matters, 7 law firms, 3 jurisdictions, half a dozen countries, 7 countries have law. This is a huge effort, and it cannot be made for our friends here if they print something about the United States. It's a huge effort. It's already intimidatory. So if and when, sorry, I'll leave out if, when Julian returns here, it gives significance to journalists. It gives journalists prestige, makes them hard to attack. It gives publishers their power back, makes them hard to attack. Unlike Australian government, the minute Julian was dragged out of the embassy and a few hours later, 50 minutes later, appeared before the court. Shameful. Appeared before the court that week, the Australian government raided 3 journalists. When Julian returns, it returns prestige and significance to journalists and power and influence to ordinary publishers like our friends.
Thanks, John. Just a little follow-up. Why is it that The Guardian, in particular, appears to have something of a vendetta against Julian? The Guardian's meant to be this progressive publication, and they've certainly profited as much as any from the work that he's done with WikiLeaks. Is there any explanation?
Well, I don't know. You know, they suborned 3 of Julian's employees and then gave them jobs after they ratted on WikiLeaks and Julian. I don't know what, under Catherine Viner, they printed a falsity on the front page that Manafort had visited Julian. And it's a proven falsity. Julian's the most surveilled man on earth, except for a couple of presidents like Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump. It's impossible to have a visit that's not recorded. And yet the Guardian prints on its front page that Julian had such a visit. Well, it's just not true. It's just not true. Why they are like they are, I don't know. I could say fake news, but you know, that's not sufficient explanation. It's just a blank wall. I don't know why they are like they are. They just are. And deservedly, we no longer have faith in or faith is the sort of wrong word. We know there's a credibility gap. We know stuff more than they know, more now than they know, thanks to online publications.
My hunch on that one is, first I thought it was just a cultural and class thing that the Brits find Australians fairly blunt and obnoxious and kind of colonial, and all these people, the Guardian, jump through the hoops of Oxford and Cambridge to get where they are, and Julian just appears in 2010 like a rock star, media rock star, and I think there's a lot of professional resentment. Secondly, and I was talking to a Guardian feature writer, and he said, no, it's more serious than that. Journalists value being the gatekeepers of secrets. Who gets to know, how much they get to know, when they get to know. And WikiLeaks comes along with the primary data and goes, you work it out, you know. And then, but more seriously, I think it's possibly the US grand jury after are more than just Julian, and some of those might be Guardian journalists. So the attitude of, we'll give you the head of Julian Assange if you leave our boys and girls alone, I think is a possibility. And that was one of the reasons the judge argued that the indictment shouldn't be opened. It was a secret indictment until they played it, and he argued that they still might be pursuing other people. And it's interesting that Somerset Bean from Adelaide, the DOJ had just asked Google for all his stuff, and he's basically the graphics guy who puts out posters and stuff, so I don't know how broad the net's going to be.
Ciaron, you know, while you're speaking, what similarities do you see between your situation, your case, and Julian's event?
Yeah, I think, you know, I was the longest civilian war resister in terms of serving the sentence. It was 13 months for disabling a B-52 bomber in the United States and conspiracy. But there were like 200 members of the US military who served 6 months to 6 years. And you know, you never know where resistance will come from, you know, and who thought it would be the geeks that offered the biggest threat, you know, and or it'd come out of the military, like my godson Ben Griffin, who refused to redeploy as British SAS in Iraq, Jimmy Massey and others. And I think if we march against war, what we do, and 1.5 million people march against that war in London, is you incite people to non-violently resist the war. And that might be non-violent direct action, disabling weapons. It might mean whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning. It might mean journalists and publishers. And we don't all have to go to prison. I believe if 1% of the people who marched against that war had gone to prison in resistance, and the other 99% who marched and fed the cat, dealt with hysterical parents and did solidarity, we could have stopped that war. That war is ongoing. And so Julian, I mean, he struck in 2010, I thought this is a guy who, probably in human history, that has pissed off the most amount of powerful people in the shortest amount of time, you know. And I thought Jesus tried his best, but probably didn't have the tech reach, you know. And also the person who went from like 0 to 0, who was on the front page of Time magazine. And I lived with Philip Berrigan, him and Dan were on the front page of Time magazine in 1968. By 1972, Hoover and Nixon had totally marginalised him. So, you know, Julian is not to be romanticised or demonised. It's as racist to romanticise Aboriginal people or Irish people or Timorese people as it is to demonise them. You know, human liberation, humanity is freedom, and it's very messy. And he is, you know, to watch him deteriorate over 9 years, it's been 9 years, and to see him physically and mentally deteriorate. And the British are very, very good at this. You know, they're good at the long game. You know, they invented cricket, and they know all the pressure points. They turn the screws, and you know, and he's a human being, and he's one of us. And we've really got to. You know, I remember first time I appeared in court, I was kind of running from the tube station to get there, and ironically, this thing popped into my mind. It was like Queenslander, you know, the Boarding Town, and it was like state of origin thing, and thinking, I know this guy. This guy grew up in the 80s, in the anti-war movement, in the anti-nuclear movement like I did. He's not, you know, they want to present him as like, you know, Gollum out of Lord of the Rings or some hyper-intelligent life form from another planet. He's a human being with a father and mother and kids and brothers and siblings. And he really is a person of empathy. You know, and you can tell that because Edward Snowden isn't in chains today, isn't in prison today, because Sarah and Julian rescued Edward Snowden from Hong Kong, where the Guardian left him to rot. You know.
John, back to you. So, one of the things that struck me as rather strange was that Peter Grester, who is who was also found himself imprisoned, has gone to great lengths as well to say that Julian is not a proper journalist and so should not be afforded the same rights and protections as other journalists. And yet Assange and WikiLeaks and its journalists have received many media awards, which would indicate the opposite is true. Now, I'm just going to quickly read through these in case anybody has any doubts about Julian's credibility as a journalist and WikiLeaks. So, the Economist New Media Award, the Amnesty New Media Award, the Sam Adams Award for Integrity, the National Union of Journalists Journalist of the Year, the Sydney Peace Foundation Gold Medal, the Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism, the Blaine Kerner Award for Best Communicator, the Voltaire Award for Free Speech, the International Piero Passetti Journalism Prize of the National Union of Italian Journalists, the Jose Cuso Press Freedom Award, the Privacy International Hero of Privacy, the Global Exchange Human Rights People's Choice Award, the Yoko Ono Lennon Courage Award for the Arts, the Brazilian Press Association Human Rights Award, the Kazakhstan Union of Journalists Top Prize, and the Walkley Award for the most outstanding contributions to journalism. Certainly more than Peter Grester, just quietly. John, it must be hard for Julian not to feel bitter about this.
Gee, that's impressive list of awards. Last time I counted there were 16. I keep picking them up on Julian's behalf. Yeah, I never found any bitterness in Julian. And if I can try and you know, he's a sweet-natured man. The other day, we were there with John Rees, visiting him. John Rees is the campaign leader in the United Kingdom. And we went, Julian and John went through stuff, but I just sort of hang around. And John went, and Julian turned to me and said, "Oh, I'm not so charming these days. Can you apologise to John for me?" Still thoughtful. Now, just if I can, you'll indulge me, I'll tell you a story. When the Collateral Murder video came out, I've told this a few times now, they decrypted it and looked at and saw I think it's about 18 people killed altogether, slaughtered. So Julian and Kristen conferred, and Kristen went to Iraq and got permission to go into Sadr City in an attempt to give names to those slaughtered, names to the dead. In every Australian town, you'll see an obelisk of one form or another, and it'll have the names of the dead. In Washington, they have a big long wall with 60,000 names on it of the people killed in that war that are Americans. All over England, all those huge cemeteries in Flanders Fields name the dead. So Kristen and Julian attempted to give names to those people you see They have mothers, fathers, and children, wives, aunties, uncles, sisters, brothers. Julian tried to give names to them, and Kristen tried to track them down. Now, you can see the video of Kristen in Cedar City, and he opens up the video, and to the relatives of those men slaughtered, some of the men slaughtered, he plays the video, and the poor people fall to the floor screaming in pain and mental agony. That's the actual situation of those wars. That's what really happens. And for a man who's banged up, and as Ciaron reveals, there's no end. There's no end. Every tomorrow is the same. You'll be there forever. For the man in that situation to work with Kristen to give names to the dead, in my view, is a considerable nobility. And he is one of us. He's of you. He's of our blood here. This earth that we walk upon in Queensland, he was born in Townsville. That's his war.
Ciaron, just on Julian being one of us. Now you have known Julian for a long time. Back, was he an anti-war activist, as you mentioned beforehand? Did you know him?
No, I think since he got listed in London that I met him.
Okay. All right. So, but you know Julian now as a friend, you'd say?
Yeah.
Now Julian's had his character attacked pretty heinously through the press. He's been called all sorts of names, including a narcissist. And I think that people were saying whether he was on the spectrum and all this sort of stuff. What is your impression of Julian? John has said that he is a man of great empathy and great compassion. What is your perspective?
Yeah, I think we're all on the spectrum. I'm not at all techie. I've been getting hacked by the British Special Branch since the 90s, and a whistleblower gave my password to a woman in the House of Lords who was also getting hacked. And I took it in for Julian to look at, and he's reading it, and he started shaking his head and going, "This is such a bad password," And I'm a technophobe. My idea of communication is you write something on a piece of cardboard and stand in the street and talk to strangers. And I find him really patient with me, and I find him, really insightful and a good analysis. I took Jello Biafra from the dead Kennedys into meeting. And I tried to get Jello Biafra to do a gig at our place, and he said it was too busy. And I said, "Well, would you like to meet Julian Assange?" And then he emailed back and goes, "How does he know I exist?" And I go, "Because we'll start with Jello Biafra." He was arrested here in Brisbane in the 80s. A couple of the dead Kennedys were. So, we brought him in, and it was a great couple of hours. Like, Julian's not a punk rocker, but he's really interested and wanting to learn as much about punk as possible. He's obviously, and I took the Mannings, Chelsea Manning's aunt and uncle in to meet him just before they flew to visit Chelsea in Leavenworth prison. And he's just very Australian. Like, Chelsea's uncle is a very gentle kind of guy, and he said it was very difficult, must be very difficult for Chelsea to change schools and come back to Wales with his mother following the divorce. And Julian went, "I went to 38 schools." And I went, "Yeah, you worked out all right, didn't you?" And it was just, he was very, for that couple of hours, I was a little worried, that they'd had enough to chat about and stuff, but he's a really gracious host. He's always hosted me, I've never hosted him, obviously. And a good sense of humour, a self-depreciating sense of humour, and a very compassionate person, and doesn't like bullies, and he just sees bullies are running wild, and ruling the world. And he's in a very tough prison. This is Belmarsh, where they housed the IRA in the 90s and 80s. And the court, they immediately transferred the case to, back in 2010, to Woolwich Crown Courts, where the case had been moved back again, was built for the IRA. It's a bomb-proof court. And to put him in that setting, what they regard as a terrorist setting, wasn't a coincidence, And he's 22 hours lockdown, he's on controlled moves. Like Tommy Robertson from the EDL was put in Belmarsh, and he said he never met another prisoner because he was on controlled moves. As soon as they moved you, they clear the wing, they put people in their cells. So he never spontaneously runs into another prisoner, and he's a very social guy. He was doing pretty well in the general population. So they moved him to medical, and they put him in solitary. And it's just this drip feed. And I met Patrick Maguire, who was like 14 when the British Special Branch dragged him from his bed and framed him on the Guildford pub bombings, 14. And his mother was a conservative woman. She served 11 years in prison. So this miscarriages of justice aren't unusual in Britain. There's a long history of them. There's a long history of demonising people and spinning them and stuff. And it's just, it's not... it's not the person I know or recognise. And the people who accuse him of narcissism, as Goebel said, you don't accuse your enemy of just anything. You accuse them of exactly what you're going to do, exactly what you are. And so it's the narcissist accusing him.
Thanks.
I just wanted to follow up a question with you, Ciaron. Given that you have actually been in a similar situation to Julian in terms of being in prison, certainly, why do you think, that you received 13 months, I believe, you served, and a couple of years, but in Julian's case, they're planning to throw away the key?
Yeah, I'm not the only one in this audience who's been to prison. And we did a lot of good work from the street and the suburb to close Bobberoe Jail. We made our contribution. Obviously, the prisons themselves took the big risks. And so I've spent time in maximum security prisons in Darwin and Brisbane and the United States and in Ireland. When I was a federal prisoner in the United States, I hardly met anyone in those 13 months who had a trial. What they do in the States is this horse trading plea bargaining. So they'll threaten Julian with 175 years and then they'll offer him 20 or 30 and say, look, and that's most of the prisoners in jail in the States, in the federal system anyway. And it also, like Gareth Pearce is a wonderful lawyer in Ireland. She's regarded as a saint. She freed the Guildford 4, the Birmingham 6. She's representing Julian. And the woman who was initially prosecuting him was representing Pinochet in England. So she wrote an article in the London Review of Books, and she was arguing against any extradition from Europe, because in Europe, and Britain is still part of Europe at the moment, the right of human association is recognised as a basic human right, along with ablutions and shelter and clothing. In the United States, it's not. How they interpret the Eighth Amendment is that human association is not. So they've got over 50 or 60,000 prisoners in their system that are in isolation for life with no outbreak. So Julian will either be taken to the States and set up to be killed in prison. It's very easy to get killed in prison. Or it'll be put in a place like Florence, Colorado, where you don't never see another prisoner. You never know what part of the jail you're in. So it's quite frightening, and it's not a surprise that he's now, because he's in isolation, not doing well physically and mentally. He's a very social guy. He likes chatting to people, it's a real drip feed. It's been a 9-year attack, and you can't overemphasise that last year at the embassy. It became like the Truman Show. They just kept putting cameras in. They had a live feed to Quito from within the prison. We now know they had a live feed to the CIA through the Spanish court case. And they also had a live feed outside the Ecuador embassy to the local police station. I was living in the alley in a box of like a coffin, and they had 25 security cameras just in that alley. So, you go to visit Julian, especially in the later years, and it was all this, as they do in football matches, take off your lead read, and the last year they're just passing messages to each other, writing and passing, and it became a very, very intense surveillance scene.
Back to you, John. Look, Julia Gillard said Assange was a criminal before he'd ever faced any charges at all. And from an outside viewpoint, it looks as if he hasn't received effective consular support from all the subsequent governments, Australian governments, since his arrest. How does Julian feel now about the Australian government and the Australian people as a whole?
You know, Gareth Peirce wrote to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and the department wrote back saying that Julian has had 100 consular assistances in one form or another, which is a testament to failure. He's there still. So the Australian government has been complicit, with notable exceptions. Malcolm Turnbull asked Julie Bishop, the Foreign Minister, to inquire about Julian at a meeting in London with Jeremy Hunt, which she did, and found a whole raft of aversions. A week later, she raised the subject with Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State of the United States, and he replied, "We have no intention of talking about that matter." So it needs strong and firm involvement of the United States at a diplomatic level, not consular. Consular, they come and give you a newspaper, and you know, the consular visits in the last year, from memory there were 3, were recorded audio and video. These are private consular visits of Australian officials to Julian. But we see from the Morrison government nothing, no response. The Morrison government, so we keep on putting in FOIs. Must be a pest for them anyway, they go in every week now. And they cover everything that we can think of. So I got some back and I read them. Now, Nils Melzer's full 36-page report is amongst the FOIs, so they have read it. They've received it and read it. In that, Nils Melzer deconstructs the Swedish allegations, deconstructs them completely. Now, they've had that report for a good while, since it was made. At Senate Estimates hearing about a month ago, Maurice Payne was asked a question and she replied that Julian has rape allegations, the plural and the non-fact. So this is a calumny against citizen of Australia, Julian Assange, by the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Anyway, looking at your faces, I think I'm being a bit too depressing, but yeah, forgive me, but sometimes these questions don't have a witty end. I'll try and make up something amusing next time.
Yeah, I remember the first time we had a lengthy conversation with Julian. We were asked by WikiLeaks to provide security for him to get him into court and out of court. And I look big, you know, I haven't had a decent fight for 30 years, but I got him as a trained killer. He was from the British SAS, and he was in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Northern Ireland, and Macedonia. Anyway, we went up there to meet him, and at one point he was reflecting on the disingenuous nature of the British media establishment. I remember him jumping up from the couch and going, "I'm an Australian, I'm not a fucking liar," you know, and I thought, yeah, too right, mate. And he really was the best of Australianness, you know, of that egalitarian thing, no one's above me, no one's below me. I mean, the British thing is so class-ridden, the whole culture there. The Americans are kind of over-polite, you don't really trust them. But Australians, even though they're know, like the British will piss on you and tell you it's raining. The Australians will piss on you and give you a weather forecast for the next time they're going to piss on you. And it, like, and you know, he has a lot of hope in Australia, and he has a very Australian identity. And you know, it reminded me of the people I met at Jabiluka and the people I met at Melbourne, the World Economic Forum. You know, Australians at their best and resourceful, and he's obviously committed to his work, and he's been at this, you know, since childhood, and he should be really celebrated in his culture in this country.
Just a follow up on that one. Sort of despite what Ciaron said, it does appear as if Julian's received far more support internationally than he has from Australians, present company excluded, of course. John, why do you think that might be? That it doesn't seem as if, you know, Australian publications, the Australian government, and it seems a healthy section or a large section of the Australian community haven't swung behind him.
Well, answering the last first, wherever I go, I find tremendous support. There's no institutional support for Julian, which the institutions normally channel, like lightning rod, channel the interests of the public upward. And no institutional support means that there's no means, until now, for us to make our feelings known to the government. The support internationally, you know, I see people at the very highest level it's not because of me, by the way, because of you guys. You know, I see people at the very highest level in Italy, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and they've established a cross-party group in Italy. They've established a cross-party group in Germany. Again, I met the man who inherited Der Spiegel, the largest selling newspaper. So at the very highest level, they are interested in this situation because it's European publications. It's the United States intimidating everybody who makes commentary about any action of the state or their corporation. So, you know, Europe has been plundered by Google. It's plundered by Apple. They don't pay any tax. They do transfer pricing. They're plundered by Facebook. Google uses its influence on the American government to resist the EU's attempt to break up Google into smaller units. That's why they're supporting, because they have an enormous problem. Their publishers can't publish, their journalists can't write, and their ordinary people are intimidated in this circumstance. So wherever I go, there's an enthusiastic response. But amusingly, I had a meeting with Kristen, and the leader of the largest union, and some MEPs and MPs, German MPs in the Bundestag. There was a full house like here. There were no, except for one, there were no mass media. So the legacy media avoided it. It was a full house full of important avenues of organisation. The next day we flew to Cologne, and a church group called Peace something or other, I forget in German, had put on an event like today. And again, it was the same, you know, looking over all middle-aged people. Every single mass media reported on the church event. So, you know, we'll get there.
think one of Julian's lawyers, Jen Robinson, reflected where Julian is popular is at the extremities of empire. Like, he's really big in Bangladesh, but where he's not popular is at the centre of empire. And a lot of hostility in England, you know. And there was quite general sympathy, I think, on the Liberal left in the United States until Clinton blamed her election loss on WikiLeaks. And a general scepticism in Australia, sceptical support, but apparently according to Jen Robinson, he's popular at the extremities in empire.
Very interesting.
John, many people obviously applaud WikiLeaks' work because it has shone a light on the activities of governments and the surveillance state. Many of them arguably immoral, if not illegal. On the other hand, others suggest that WikiLeaks' activities have put in jeopardy the security of individual agents and governments. How do you reconcile this, and where do you draw the line? Well, people have said that some of his activities have put people in jeopardy, security of individual agents and governments, for example.
Just briefly, Robert Gates, who's Secretary of State, testified before Congress that it didn't do us any harm. No. Was anybody harmed? No. Was it awkward? Yes. Is it embarrassing? Yes. The Australian government made an inquiry that it was Australian interest harmed or anybody harmed. No, their report says no. The American government did the same investigation and gave the same answer. This is a technique. I use it sometimes to amuse the little girl. I said, oh, look at a cockroach up there. And then I'd take one of her toys just for fun. It's just that simple. They don't want us to see the crimes. They don't want us to insist that those who did cause the destruction of 8 countries in 20 years, 1 million dead, millions displaced, they don't want us to focus on that. They say Julian is this or somebody. Once I saw an official, an American official, responsible for there have been many of them, responsible for the administration of the destruction of Iraq, say he endangered lives. Can you imagine anything more grotesque, anything more obscene than this blighter getting up there who administers the destruction of Iraq, saying he endangered lives? They're mad. I think they're ghouls, actually. They're conjured up by magic and they get these jobs.
Just to reflect briefly on the nature of crime, I think it's interesting. I mean, as radical Christians, a few of us, where you read the scripture, your location, locus imperii, is important. And, when we begin reading it, when we're hosting Aboriginal kids in the street and reading it in jail and stuff, and one of the first people I met in Bogger Road said, people will stop robbing banks when banks stop robbing people. And I think what that points to is there's wholesale crime and retail crime. There's wholesale theft, killing and dealing in dangerous substances, and that's done by governments and corporations. And unfortunately, a lot of people we meet in jail aren't there for heroically rebelling against capitalism. They're there for mimicking it and retail attempts. And they're also in there as victims of historical crimes like the theft of their lands and culture and stuff like that. So war is significant because it's violence that sustains exploitation. Just as peace is the basis, as justice is the basis of peace, violence and the ability to kill is the basis of maintaining systems of exploitation. And, we share a fence, our family, with Gallipoli Barracks. My mother had 3 uncles who went to World War I through there, and then we were growing up during Vietnam, and they had conscription. Now, all they need from us You know, they had to mobilise the whole society for World War I and World War II. They needed your firstborn son for Vietnam. All they need now is for us to avert our gaze, to look the other way. And if Chelsea Manning had done that in Baghdad, Chelsea Manning would not have been tortured and imprisoned. And if Julian Assange had commodified his gifts, he'd be poolside in Silicon Valley as a multi-millionaire and not in prison. And that's, it's a criminal, this whole system's a criminal enterprise.
We're going to have to wrap this up.